candlelight bled across the rush-strewn floor. Snow pressed against the shutters like a held breath, and the girl curled around pain that came in iron waves. The record shows she was 13, a slim body in a wool shift, a name bound to other names that lived in parchment and rumour. The room smelled of tallow and damp stone, and the winter outside would not move. A midwife warmed her hands above a brazier. Another pinched the girl's hip and muttered about bone and passage. They spoke softly, as if the house might overhear and render judgment. Beyond the door, the South Bailey lay quiet under frost. The gatehouse lamp showed a narrow cone of light, whitening flakes that drifted sideways. In the buttery, a jug of small beer stood clouded and cold. The clerk kept his place at a trestle and copied figures by rushlight. Head bowed, ink stiff in the well. Steward lists confirmed the linens counted and the rye allotted, the small order of honey for an infusion. He wrote as if the numbers might shelter her. The first scream fled up the stair and vanished into the dark timber of the great hall. A dog thumped once against a chest and settled, as if the sound concerned only the living and not the law. It was late Advent, the weeks when evenings come early and candles grow mean. A bell in the chapel of St. Mary answered the wind, a hollow ring that skated across the yard and under the door. She tasted copper at the back of her throat. The midwife tilted a cup, brewed with pennyroyal and whatever warmth the brazier could coax from the room. Steam climbed the candle and broke in little ghosts. Outside, the great house meadows were a sheet of dull pewter. Snow stitched the hedgerows into one breathless seam. Inside, the bed ropes creaked when another pain came, and the girl bit a fold of linen until thread marked her tongue. They spoke of narrow hips, and one pressed her palm to the girl's belly, measuring not with instruments but with practice. Will suggests this was not the first time Winter watched a birth in Bletsoe, but the house remembered poorly and kept its counsel. On the stair, a messenger stamped his boots and waited for news. His hood was rimmed with rime. The clerk looked up once, then set his reed and wrote again, numbers like beads to worry against fear. The girl forced air into her lungs. The shard of her prayer caught and fell. The midwife said her name and told her to push with the breath, not the throat. Words were a rope. The rope burned the hands. A gust lifted the latch and the door complained. Snow hissed along the floorboards and died near the brazier. The older midwife shut it with her hip and murmured to the younger about patience and force and the cost of both. A contraction built like a storm in a narrow valley. When it broke, she saw red stars that had no warmth. She went away for 3 heartbeats, then returned to a room that smelled of wool and smoke. In the hall, a tapestry moved a finger's breadth, stirred by a draught that had learned the house years ago and remembered all the ways inside. Somewhere under the table a cat shifted and resumed its long sleep. The clerk paused, touched the nib to his tongue, and added a line about wax and thread. The rolls note a small purchase of goose grease, nothing more. His entries were not prayers, but they leaned in that direction. A cry started in the girl's chest, grew larger than her, and left her mouth as heat. The midwife was a stone at her shoulder. The other midwife counted quietly, not numbers, but the spaces between them. "Listen," the older one said, and the word struck the air like a nail. "When the next comes, make it your own. Not its master, its rider." She nodded, teeth clenched, jaw trembling. The next pain rose and she climbed it, thighs shaking, fingers searching for wood and finding a hand instead. In the yard, the messenger took a turn beneath the gatehouse arch. His breath built a little cloud and drifted off toward the fields. He could hear nothing now but the wind. A candle guttered, recovered, guttered again. The midwife trimmed the wick with a pinch and smeared grease along the lip to quiet the flame. The light steadied, and the room returned to itself. It had begun as fear. It became a contest. She understood that somewhere between the first scream and the second hour, when time loosened and minutes slipped away without leaving footprints, they turned her on her side, propped her with bolsters stitched from last year's linen. The younger midwife pressed a hot cloth where the body would argue. Steam rose again from the brazier and blurred the air. The clerk set his quill down and listened. He was not supposed to. A London letter reports that in those winters men pretended not to hear what women endured, because they could not fix it and would not admit it. Pain lifted and set her down. Lifted and set her down. The older midwife checked for progress with flat hands and an ear for breath. She nodded once, small and satisfied, like a man hearing coin ring true. Again, she said, make this one count. The girl pushed and felt something move that had been locked. The midwife's praise was brief and ordinary, which made it more powerful than song. The younger fetched fresh linen and cleared the old. In the chapel, a single wax taper burned down to a collar and bent low in surrender. Somewhere in the manor the kitchen fire sank and was urged alive with poker and breath. The clerk closed his book and stood, his knees cracked. He stepped into the passage and watched the snow change direction as wind worried at the corner of the house. He wanted to pray, and did not know how. Another surge came like an order. She obeyed, then fought it, then owned it. The older midwife set her palm on the girl's brow. "Look at me," she said, and the command was a door. She looked. She found a steadiness there that did not ask whether she was ready. It required only that she would do the thing no one else could do for her. "Now," the midwife said. "Now." She bore down with whatever was left. The room narrowed to breath, pressure, and a small cry that was not yet loud enough to be certain. Not yet. The younger midwife shifted, hands ready. The older leaned into the moment, unblinking. The candle made a shallow dish of light. A wet crown appeared, then slipped back. The older midwife did a thing she did not name. The girl felt fire, then broke through it. The cry came back with a will and shook the rafters of her body. It was answer and demand in one. The midwife said good, and meant it. Outside, snow leaned harder against the gatehouse and began to drift ankle-high. The messenger stamped once more, not from impatience, but because the cold insists on being honoured. Inside, the younger midwife wrapped a portion of the world in warmed linen. The older checked the mother for ruin and found none she could not accept. She lay back and listened to the small sound that had replaced her own. The room smelled now of salt and wool and something metallic that would fade with water and time. Chroniclers insist the true birth would happen months later, at a different castle, under other stones. Tonight was the rehearsal the body demanded, and the world mistook for an omen. The clerk returned to his bench and added one line without figures. He did not write her name. He wrote the word kept, and it covered a multitude. The older midwife pressed the swaddled bundle to the girl's breast for a moment, not for milk, but for recognition. The bundle protested, and then agreed that warmth is a kind of map. Snow thinned to a veil, and a moon found its edge. The brazier threw a last gust of heat and went to embers. The room settled, and the house believed it would last. She touched the small cheek with one finger and felt terror open into vow. If the door to life was this narrow, she would widen every door after it. When they took the bundle away and banked the coals, the quiet was not empty. It was the quiet of a held line, of choices that would not be recalled. Outside, the lane toward Bedford was a pale ribbon under the stars. Inside, the clerk closed his book, the midwives washed, and the girl stared at the rafters and did not blink. The record shows winter kept close that year, and that hunger had to be measured against prayer. None of it explains how a decision becomes a spine. She felt the shape of it forming as the candles shortened. It would not be negotiated away. It would be carried. By dawn the wind had turned, and the drift at the gatehouse lay shaped like a shield. She saw it when the door opened, and understood the image without words. The vow hardened with daylight, and did not crack. Whatever the world asked of her, she would answer with a name that outlived. Snow. A blackened campaign banner lay folded in a chest that smelled of wet leather, while a London letter reports his return wrapped in failure and whispers of disgrace. The conflict moved like frost across the Beaufort name, and the child felt its bite before she learned its cause. Candlemas had passed, and Lent crept over the manor like a sober veil. In the solar at Bletsoe, the widow counted rents with thumb and nail, steady because someone must be steady. The clerk stood by the lattice and read the tallies, careful with every number. He had been writing to Westminster since Twelfth Night. The rolls note a shipment of wax and a modest dray of oats sent down the Bedford road, as if trade could barter with shame. Outside, rooks stitched black loops above the orchard. Word came before the grass greened. A messenger coughed at the gatehouse and asked for wine he did not drink. He carried a second letter under his sleeve, where men keep knives. He did not watch her open it. There were facts, the record shows, and then there were sentences sharpened by rumour. Normandy had given him no triumphs to polish. Parliament would not be patient. The girl was told in the kitchen, because kitchens endure. She stood by the chopping block while steam rose from a pot and made a brief room inside the room. The widow did not cry. She measured. He had failed in France, they said, and his temper had turned against himself. A priest from St. Mary's walked the yard with a hand inside his cloak, as if to hold his ribs together. He spoke of souls and of storms that choose their trees. The clerk kept his pen still until the priest finished. A trader from Cheapside stopped for fodder and left a rumour about a sealed chamber and an unlatched window. Will suggest men make stories, because the body demands a tidy end. In London, Fleet Street carried the news faster than horses. At Paul's Cross, a deacon lifted his chin and let the crowd hear that even dukes can stumble into pits they dug with pride. No one mentioned who handed them the spade. She learned the shape of her father's absence by how people spoke to her. They softened her name as if it might bruise. They praised her manners as if manners could amend lineage. She nodded and travelled through the days like a shadow with edges. The widow turned to accounts and alliances. Margaret of Anjou's circle hummed with opinions that changed with weather. A winter favour meant little by Easter. A summer promise might not live to Michaelmas. A solicitor arrived from Westminster Hall and bowed to the rushes. He talked of wardship, of fortunes that move like tide under Tower Wharf, and of marriages that paid debts quicker than any chest of coin. He smiled as if smiling were currency. The clerk showed him out through the south passage and did not return the smile. He walked the lane toward the dovecote and listened to pigeons argue about grain. He had no vote in the matter. He could count. He could witness. The funeral was not hers to attend, not in the way her heart required. The digger swung his spade in earth that clung like wet bread. He measured once with the length of his forearm and found the depth sufficient for a duke who had not found enough of anything. Chroniclers insist the end was a choice. Others muttered scaffolds of mercy around the fact and called them gentler truth. The widow chose a different scaffold made of work and paper. She wrote letters that held the tone of stone warmed by hand. At night, she taught the child to pray in words that fit inside a mouth small from winter. During daylight, she taught the child to study faces until faces yielded. Spring came on, reluctant and necessary. At Michaelmas, flocks trailed dust along the road to Bedford Market, and a drummer beat time for a levy no one wanted. The manor roof no longer leaked where the joiner had pled with pitch. The child watched a kestrel hold itself upon nothing, tail fanned, wings writing a slow argument against gravity. In London again, Baynard's castle grew voices like ivy. A counsellor with an old scar said the Beaufort girl could be made useful if placed at the correct table. Useful meant obedient. Useful meant that her father's ledger could be balanced in flesh. The widow folded that thought and put it away like a dangerous knife. She stood at Paul's Walk and listened for names, and she heard de la Pole more than once. His house could launder many kinds of stain if the price did not blow a hole through the floor. The clerk rented a room near Bread Street above a cooper's shop. He copied a bond by rushlight and heard laughter roll up from the alley. A London letter reports new anger at the losses in Maine and Anjou, and new wagers on who will carry the blame like a yoke. The girl learned to sit very still. She practised holding the air in her chest without swallowing it. She practised laying her hands upon her skirt as if the cloth were delicate and not rough as a sack. When she faltered, the widow corrected softly and precisely. One afternoon a hawker cried news at Ludgate and called her father's name without courtesy. She did not flinch. She looked at the hawker and saw a man with a sore foot, a wife who worried, and a voice for rent. The digger passed the churchyard and wiped his blade with straw. He had no word for scandal. He had work. Earth asks the same question of every house, and a spade knows only answers. At Bletsoe, the orchard gave fruit late and small. A childless ewe nuzzled another's lamb and accepted a gentle but permanent disappointment. The girl learned that hunger and mercy can share a field without shaking hands. When the wind came from the south, the house smelled of river. A cartwheel split near the ford, and the clerk rolled up his sleeves and found the knot. He worked until the wheel held. Then he wiped his palms on grass and returned to his papers. He had copied a sentence about a contract she would not read for years. It promised nothing and suggested everything. It moved her from danger toward a different danger with better tapestries. The widow spoke with a friar near Greyfriars and a merchant under the eaves at Leadenhall. She traded courtesy for news and news for counsel. She did not ask for kindness. She knew the rate and paid it. By All Hallows, leaves clattered along the lane like thin coins. The girl walked the yard and found the world narrower than before and harder beneath the same shoes. She touched the gate-post and felt how wood accepts names without speaking them. She asked what a vow costs and how long it takes to pay. The widow did not answer with words. She pressed a scrap of cloth into the child's palm. It had been cut from a sleeve and stitched over years with careful red. The clerk counted the days to Advent and marked them with slashes. He watched a star through the arrow slit and measured how the sky resets what men upset. He set the quill down and looked into the dark and said a name without sound. In Fleet Street, a pardoner raised his voice about sin and offered paper that could not hold water. The girl heard him and understood paper makes men brave until rain. She turned her face away from his booth and toward the wind that came smelling of coal and Thames mud. A note passed from Temple Bar to Cheapside like a small fish slipping through reeds. It carried a suggestion wrapped as advice. It named a future no one would say aloud at table. It coiled on the widow's tongue and tasted of iron. The widow did not spit it out. She made a list instead, and the list contained streets and names and the exact number of candles needed for a day spent waiting in Westminster Hall. Lists are the handrails for steep stairs. The digger paused by the hedge and watched crows argue over a crust. He raised his cap to no one, because sometimes respect is a way to leave a field without making an enemy. He had learned that from soil. On the Sunday before Epiphany, bells wandered across the county. They carried news of births and banns, and the old year folded small. The child stood at the chapel door and felt the draught rake her ankles. Steward lists confirm another order of wax. Light would be needed, because men prefer to see the path that narrows. The clerk folded the page and pressed it with bone. She took the vow where no one saw it happen. She would change the math that reduced a daughter to a ledger entry. She would pay what the vow required, even if the coin were measured in breath and quiet. The chest with the banner stayed closed. The widow waited for a letter that would confirm a match and open another door. The clerk sharpened a quill and watched for the rider at the lane's bend near the hedgerow. Snow threatened again from the east. The girl set her shoulders as if snow were only weather and not a verdict. She was not wrong. She would learn to bend. Names until they bore weight. Snowmelt striped the stair at Baynard's castle while voices braided under maps. A London letter reports the Queen's temper after Maine's surrender. The conflict narrowed to a contract. Names angled like knives on parchment, and a girl's future lay between their points. Cheapside clattered outside, indifferent to titles traded like salt. It was mid-Lent, the alleys smelling of fish, ink and rain. A solicitor tapped wax with a ring and smiled as if blessing bread. The widow kept her hands folded, stillness inside a room engineered for movement. The clerk watched the leaded panes and counted breaths because numbers obeyed him. The record shows messages running between Westminster Hall and Suffolk's men, brisk and incurious. Someone said usefulness, someone else said wardship. Everyone meant leverage disguised as care. Her father's absence lay on the table like a mute seal. They arranged futures as butchers arrange hooks, each distance deliberate, each height a signal. Wills suggest the match would wash old stains and paint new ones thin enough to please candles. No one asked if thin paint cracks in winter. The child watched lips, not words, because lips reveal when truth is rented. A map pin traced routes from Tower Wharf to Calais, then stopped where seas unfasten men. She felt the moment tilt. The widow inclined her head by the breadth of a prayer, and said yes without using the word. That was the reversal, quiet as ash. Consent turned into instrument, not surrender. The clerk wrote, while thunder that was only rumour walked along the Thames. Steward lists confirm wine for Delapole gentlemen, and a small jar of cloves. Hospitality is a bridge that taxes the river. In the yard, grooms rubbed steam from horse necks and debated who truly commands a marriage, while upstairs parchment folded like careful linen and sealed shut. The Queen's name hovered like weather inside every clause. Chroniclers insist anger at Anjou's loss demanded recompense paid in bodies rather than coin. She did not bow. She measured angles, remembered doors, and planned to bar one after passing. Dusk brought braziers to Cheapside and arguments about saffron and pewter. The widow bought silence with compliments that looked like thanks. The clerk carried the contract down Bread Street like a candle in wind, thinking of outcomes that behave, not of love. At Bletsoe, the hall smelled of thyme, damp wool and ash. They sat near the fire to speak plainly without witnesses. The widow explained what the law intended and what intention would never admit. She named the house that sought her, the debts shadowing it, and the benefit promised. The girl pressed her palm to the bench and felt the grain say proceed. She nodded once, not as a child, but as a person who weighs scales. A candle steadied, and decision became path. The Rolls Note cloth ordered for a presentation at Suffolk Place near Southwark. Colour was discussed like warfare. Sleeve breadth, sharper than prayer. On the day set, Ludgate's arch framed a sky polished by wind and talk. They entered without flourish, competence wrapped in plain wool. A Delapole aunt appraised her as millers appraise grain quietly and for profit. The girl met the gaze, and neither trespassed nor retreated. It was rogation tide. Banners moved past St. Sepulchre and St. Bride, while lawns recovered. Inside Suffolk Place the air held cinnamon and consequence. A London letter reports gossip that the Queen herself would glance at the girl's poise. The glance never came, and the rumour did its work alone. The clerk tallied portions that moved faster than rain along eaves. The widow traced a cross on the girl's wrist where gloves would hide it. She whispered iron. Use their table, then keep your own count. At supper, abundance pretended to launder intent, and she ate with measured courtesy. Night settled over Southwark, and the river kept counsel with its reflections. Before prime, the clerk walked Tower Street and watched ovens accept first heat. In a bright chamber, glass made the air colder. The solicitor read clauses until language sounded like hooves. She heard the part where obedience wore the mask of safety. She spoke the necessary words and understood they would not return. That was the choice that would not unmake itself. Sand settled on signatures, and a livery boy carried pages to an iron-banded coffer. Miles away, the digger turned soil for a spring burial by St. Michael's hedge. He did not know her name. He knew how ground accepts arrangements. Contracts and graves share an alphabet learned by patience. At noon, Sun found the seam of her sleeve in the yard. Noise from the shambles pressed in, copper, brine, and argument. A hawk rode a pocket of air above Newgate and held like a promise. She matched its poise with breath and kept that steadiness for later rooms. By vespers, copies multiplied, bearing more wax than sense. Policy cooled the Queen's temper into something that refuses to look backward. Chroniclers insist the match strengthened certain walls and weakened certain men. The widow inventoried favours earned and favours owed, and the page did not stay clean. The clerk tied the last transcript with blue thread and noted a silence too heavy for ink. They left by Ludgate again, because returning through the same door proves intention. Rain rehearsed the evening, then committed. She breathed river metal and thought of fields that remember names without liking them. Her path bent toward a future decided by others, yet pliable under pressure. The vow carried from winter did not soften. It learned new grammar. She stepped into night as if it were a ledger she intended to balance. Smoke curled under the rafters of the great hall while damp wool held the smell of rain, and torches salted the air with pitch. Household accounts note a woad-dyed gown borrowed from a cousin, sleeves let out twice, which says more about provisions than romance. The conflict was simple and not simple. Old blood received new blood and argued about price. It was rogation tide, when fields wait to be blessed and roads ask for mercy. Men from Wales stood near the screen's passage, voices low, cloaks dark with travel. They were Tudors, new hands at old doors, and they watched the room as if rooms were maps. The widow kept her place beneath the tapestry of saints who had endured worse. The clerk checked the table of gifts, counted cups that would not return, and marked who offered them. "Names are weights," he wrote carefully. A priest from St. Mary's waited by the chapel door with a book that smelled of damp leather. Parish rolls attest to bans proclaimed without protest, which is another way to say protest learned to hide. Edmund arrived with a residue of sea air on his cloak. He was not tall, but certainty lengthened him. His glance touched rafters, men, windows, and came back to her without apology. They met between hearth and trestle, where heat and custom share custody. A harp sounded once and fell silent. Someone coughed. Someone else forgot to pretend they were not watching. She recognized the arithmetic, alliance paid in breath. The record shows a dowry negotiated with coin, rents, and the language of custody. It does not show the narrow place where a girl turns a ceremony into leverage. Snowmelt ticked in the courtyard rill and carried slivers of last year's leaves toward the Bedford road. Outside, a boy led horses to the stable and whispered their names like promises. Inside, the priest spoke the words that make a gate. She answered them, clear, not loud, the way one answers when the room is full of excellent listeners and few friends. Edmund's hand was warm and dry. His knuckles wore thin scars that did not brag. He made a bow with less court in it than work. The Queen's favour hovered, uninvited but present, like weather folded into cloth. Chroniclers insist some guests weighed the Beaufort name against Welsh ambition and found the sum unacceptable. They stayed for meat anyway. The clerk noted the meat. Steward lists confirm capons, a haunch of pork, and a jar of cloves opened without ceremony. Salt met gravy, and did what salt has always done. A cousin whispered about Pembroke and Carmarthen and the men who swear by winds on Milford Haven. Another cousin whispered numbers that sounded like prayers. She watched Edmund watch the room. He attended to grooms and elders, asked after a man's uncle who limped, and listened when no one expected listening. Attention is a pledge cheaper than gold and sometimes heavier. He turned back to her when he could. They spoke of Bletsoe and rain that finds the same crack each. Spring! They spoke of bread and rents and the way letters travel slower than fear. He said Wales taught him to read hills like faces. She said Bedfordshire taught her to count. The priest's voice braided their answers and made a chord. They knelt on rushes that smelled of thyme and damp. A London letter reports that a de la Pole proxy had asked, "Is she willing?" and received a reply too quiet to carry. Willingness is not the same as consent. Consent is not the same as surrender. In the buttery, a flagon failed and was replaced without comment. The clerk raised a finger and a boy ran. The widow's smile was a blade kept in a linen wrap. She handled nobles as a joiner handles oak, with long patience and small corrections. She counted how many men believed the future would arrive without negotiation. Edmund spoke vows that did not waste words. He did not promise what winters never allow. He promised steadiness, which is not small. She said the words that seal a choice into a door that cannot be unbuilt. A ribbon was tied. A cup was shared. The room breathed. He led her one step across a threshold only they could see. Outside, bells walked the parish like shepherds. Inside, a lad from the kitchen slipped and swore softly, baptized by gravy. They moved through the hall to receive, to be received, to endure receiving. Old blood measured their pace. New blood measured the measuring. The harp found a tune about fields and leaving them. A guest from Southwark praised the roast and said nothing of ancestry. Another praised the wine and forgot the name of the host. Will suggest men remember flavour longer than politics. Women remember both. She felt the reversal occur while no one clapped. Marriage did not make her small. It made her portable. Position loosened its root and learned to walk. Edmund understood without being told. He let her set the angle at which they stood to the room. He answered loud men gently and quiet men directly. He treated boasting as weather. Later, when people thawed into stories, he asked the clerk about stores for the road and the best farrier along the route to Leicester. The clerk supplied names and kept one for himself as a favour banked for later. A platter came, and she pretended to eat. Then she ate because strength is a tool, not an ornament. He pretended to drink. Then he drank because refusal offends more than agreement excuses. At dusk, torches found the soot on the rafters and made it honest. They stepped into the passage toward the chapel, where damp stone holds prayer like a low note. He spoke of Pembroke's walls and of gulls that cry like warnings. She spoke of ledgers and the comfort of columns that add. Wardrobe accounts show a cloak lined with rabbit for the journey. The seamstress stitched with hands that had no opinion. The needle voiced its own. Before Compline, the widow stood with Edmund and named the men who would test his courtesy and the women who would test hers. He listened as if briefed for war. He was. Chancery notes indicate a custody clause written without extravagance. The clause sat down between them like a third chair. She accepted it, then resolved how to move it later. They walked to the screen's passage where the smell of roast ebbed into damp rush. A groom waited with news of a shoe thrown on the east yard. Omens multiply when guests drink. She smiled and stepped over the omen as if it were merely wood. The clerk carried the marriage lines into the solar and blew the candle out with care, because smoke leaves a mark when surprised. Candle ends pooled into white coins and cooled. At the threshold of the chamber lent to them, she stopped and pressed a palm to the jamb as if testing timber. Wood took the measure and kept its opinion. He said her name once, right, without garnish. She said his, and it shortened the room to something human. They were not alone in the corridor. Houses listen. He leaned close and spoke of routes west, men loyal to Jasper, and the way storms lift off the channel and come ashore like debts. She felt the plan fold around the vow. No one had promised safety, opportunity perhaps, a wider door, if one knew how to brace it. Night sat down across Bletsoe and took its time. In the yard beyond the gatehouse, the digger crossed with a lantern and set a stake where a trench would be cut for new drainage. He measured by forearm and habit, then looked up at the lit windows and understood that some work never appears on lists. Inside, the harp stopped. The talk thinned to comfort. She unpinned the day from her shoulders, set it on the coffer, and stood a moment without title. The bed creaked as if to inform the house. Outside, frost claimed the trough under the eaves and made mirrors for a sky that had other concerns. Steward lists confirmed the last loaves counted. The spice chest closed, and the gate latched. Her life had moved from a ledger to a road, and the road had a name. By midnight, the fire collapsed into red thought and kept the room alive. Her choice would not forgive itself tomorrow. It would not have to. At Lord's, the first bell would ask the day to declare itself. She lay down beside a man who treated vows as tools and patience as shelter, and she learned a new balance that would travel. Outside, the east yard whitened by degrees, and the path toward Bedford began to shine. Rain hammered Carmarthen Castle so hard the slates hissed, and torches guttered in the passage where men went wordless. Chroniclers insist the sickness came fast and did not negotiate. Martinmas had just passed, and the River Toey dragged brown water beneath Mill Bridge. He lay on rough linen with a fever that edited faces, reaching for a knife that was not there. The taste of iron had replaced food. A priest muttered brief comfort and kept his fingers warm. The room smelled of vinegar and wool. Voices kept to the corners like servants who know their place. She arrived after dusk, cloak slick with rain, hair damp against her temples. The clerk had ridden ahead and counted blankets, candles, broth, and the space where hope usually stands. He opened the door and said a name gently, as if sound could bruise. The record shows Edmund died in Carmarthen, November's breath still on the walls. It does not record the exact angle of her body when she refused to fall. A bell in St. Peter's threw notes into rain until rain drowned them. She did what the living do when the dead make claims. She measured the next hour. She counted who might interfere. She held her breath until the room allowed another. The widow stood beside her, less mother than flank. Together they let the priest finish and listened for the part where the law walks in. A constable cleared his throat. Wardship speaks before sorrow if you give it a door. The clerk moved a step between them and the man with tidy shoes. Steward lists confirmed 2 tapers burned to ends, 3 more fetched from a chest, and wine sent for Jasper. He wrote that last word like a rope. Night gnawed the courtyard. Wind slipped through the arrow slits and stitched the candle flames into thin nerves. Men asked quiet questions and did not enjoy the answers. A London letter reports that in Westminster they already calculated the widow's portion and the unborn child's value, because numbers hurry where empathy does not. She touched Edmund's hand, cool and weightless against her palm. It felt like leather left in shade. The body was carried along the inner ward, rain beating coats and faces. A lantern showed Greyfriars roofline over Priory Street, sodden and black. The digger leaned on his spade at the friary yard and gauged wet clay by feel. He had buried better men with fewer words. He knew where water would collect by Candlemas. Earth received Edmund without ceremony. Spade, rope and prayer arranged what could still be arranged. She lowered her head and let one breath go like a coin paid. Then she turned and found Jasper fast in the gatehouse, rain lathering his brow, eyes taking the room apart. He was all angles and steadiness. Wales travelled with him like weather. "Come," he said, because there was a second loss, and it would not be hers. The castle cooked its rumour quickly. Wills suggest a steward's wife whispered that a 13-year-old cannot carry a winter's work, much less a child. The whisper wandered into mouths that liked the taste. Jasper ignored mouths. He counted guards and thought about roads. Pembroke stood west under closer stone, and men loyal to him would answer bells. The route along the southern track took them past Llandy log hedges and through a breach near Llanstefan, if tide allowed mercy. A midwife inspected the girl with hands that learned on poorer women. She nodded once and said the thing that is half medicine, half resolve. They made a pallet for the cart, padded with wool and shame. The clerk folded the death notice for Greyfriars and slid it under a token tied with blue. He fetched a tally of oats and salted beef, 2 skins of small beer, and a purse that jingled without dignity. Rain softened to a spit. The gate creaked, the smell of horses braided with smoke and wet leather. She climbed into the cart with the help of a man who looked away at the right moment. Jasper took a saddle and rode tight to the wheel. The widow mounted with less grace and more purpose. They moved along Priory Street, past a shutter where a boy watched with apple in hand. Mud sucked at wheels, and the driver swore softly as if negotiating with an old friend. In the dark, the towey sounded like a choir with a cold. Beyond the bridge, hedgerows huddled and crows fanned out like ink. A soldier at the east gate yawned and lifted a bar that weighed more than regret. They made the road by moon and ruts. She lay on her side and learned a new counting that matched pain to breaths. The midwife rubbed her back and spoke of Pembroke kitchens, where fires keep their promises better than people. A fox crossed the lane and stared. It had seen widows before. They camped near a copse where the wind lost ambition. Jasper walked the line and touched bridles, checking for trouble that liked to hide in leather. The clerk wrote by shielded flame, fingers stiff, pen telling the page what the day had taken. He noted the hour and the place, because some nights must be pinned to keep them from spreading. At dawn, mist rose from fields like forgiveness. They ate coarse bread that tasted of damp sack and swallowed it as if it were victory. Pembroke showed itself by degrees bulk and certainty above Milford Haven. Stones there have a grammar. They make men correct themselves. The outer ward received them with the indifference of systems that work. A porter blinked twice at the names and moved faster. Chancery men would come later with paper and intent. For now, doors opened. Inside the gatehouse, warmth lay thick as wool. The air smelled of smoke and onions. A dog considered them and decided they were work. Jasper gave orders as if stacking timber. He assigned rooms and placed guards where echoes travel. The midwife claimed a corner near a brazier and began collecting heat as if it were a coin. She sat on a stool and allowed hands to run their measures again. The child moved like a fish, startled, then soothed. Temple. Account suggests the priory nearby sent linen and a small statue for comfort. She accepted the linen and left the statue on the table, face to the wall. A letter went to Westminster before candles burned halfway. Another went to Baynard's Castle, because London must be fed whether it is hungry or not. The widow walked the perimeter and found weak places in stone and process. She spoke to a cook about broth, to a laundress about blood, to a steward about the weight of silence. The clerk argued with a quartermaster about oats and won by 4 measures, which is how households survive wars they do not fight. Outside, Milford Haven pushed the same tide it always pushed. Inside, breath found rhythm hungry for repetition. She learned to sleep between pains. She learned to wake into the same room and endure its patience. Chroniclers insist her youth endangered everything. They were not wrong. They were not complete. Jasper visited at matins and vespers, face quiet, boots wet. He brought news, not comfort. News is a better lamp. Men moved along the wall walk and watched roofs for smoke that meant strangers. The gatehouse recorded who came and left in a hand that carried weight. A London letter reports that certain enemies considered her wardship ripe for plucking, like an orchard in a distracted parish. Jasper had fewer letters and more horses. Days arranged themselves by bells and broth. The midwife marked time on a strip of linen with knots. The knots climbed like a prayer rung into twine. The clerk kept receipts dry in a leather case, and sharpened quills with the caution of a man who has learned what paper can cost. At night, wind found the scullery door and made it complain. She lay awake and listened for that note. It meant she was still here. The digger took work at St. Mary's Field beyond the walls and cut drains to carry water away from graves. He checked the soil each morning and nodded because it did what soil does. He did not know the girl behind the inner door, only that men carried buckets faster when bells moved. Snow threatened, and then decided not to. Rain came back instead and tapped every surface like a collector. She stood by the arrow slit and tasted salt from the haven, mouth dry, breath slow. The child turned underhand like a seal deciding about light. Edmund's name did not leave the room. It changed shape until it fit inside duty. The widow stitched a seam and hid a coin inside the hem, because coin close to the skin travels safest. She set the garment on the coffer and did not name it luck. By 12th night, the household moved as one creature. Guards knew how far a shout reached. Cooks knew whose hands shook. The chapel learned which prayers land. Steward lists confirm extra wood taken from the south store, and 2 braziers repaired with wire. Warmth is a tactic. She carried the hallway at a measured pace, and learned which stones sloped. She learned how to lean without appearing to. Pain came in a new key and asked for everything. She said yes because the question was not conditional. Jasper stood outside the door with a hand on the jamb, not entering, not leaving. The clerk sat on a chest and listened like a man that numbers can no longer protect. Wind rattled shutters. Water climbed the stone and retreated, patient as policy. The midwife took command of air, light, and sound. She turned a brazier. She folded a cloth. She spoke a sentence that divided time into before and after. The vow from winter found its shape. Whatever had ended in Carmarthen was an opening here. The door would not be kind. It would be wide enough. Frost rimmed the arrow slits of the inner ward, while brazier smoke braided with her breath, and chroniclers insist the child arrived here in late January 1457. The conflict was simple and mortal. Either the door opened, or both hearts quieted. Wind moved along the north curtain and found every gap. Torches jittered, pitching small shadows that tried to grow teeth. The midwife warmed cloths over coals and tested their heat on her wrist. A second woman counted pulses and listened for courage hidden under pain. The widow sat straight on a stool, spine like a drawn bow. She spoke little, because words were a resource to be rationed. Outside, Milford Haven pushed a grey tide against stone, and spray lifted near the Wogan Cavern. The sound arrived through the sally port like breath returning from a long walk. The clerk stood near the great keep and inventoried what cannot be inventoried. Steward lists confirm extra wood pulled from the south store and a jar of honey opened without ceremony. He wrote as if ink could widen bone. He could not widen bone. She tasted metal at the back of her tongue. A contraction lifted and set her down, the way a wave tests shore. The midwife said her name and gave her a rhythm to borrow. Borrowed rhythm is still rhythm. A bell at Monkton Priory drifted across the water, late for lauds, early for mercy. The note hung, thinned and faded into stone. The record shows Pembroke Castle took her in when roads were teeth. The record does not show how fear becomes arithmetic. Jasper paced the passage and wore a groove into the rushes. He spoke to guards in a voice that disliked waste. Rain began without warning and leaned hard against the west gate. The smell of wet iron crept under the door and sat down like a third midwife. She closed her eyes and saw her winter vow. If the door to life was this narrow, she would make a wider door later. Another pain arrived, stony and provincial, insisting on its own customs. She climbed it with what breath remained and found the top thankless. Wills suggest girls do not survive such deliveries. Wills also suggest writers prefer their sentences neat. The midwife pressed a palm low and murmured something that changed how air moved. Her hands were steady, old with other people's hours. A London letter reports that enemies in Westminster measured her wardship like grain. They were not here to hear what bodies say when paper leaves the room. The clerk brought warm water that smelled faintly of ash. He did not look away, because witnessing is a kind of payment. She felt tearing like heat and refused to float above it. Staying present became the only pride that mattered. Outside, the digger cut a trench to carry standing water off the inner yard. He measured depth by forearm and habit, and trusted soil more than rumour. The brazier coughed and steadied. Candle stubs made small lakes of cooling fat. Another surge hunted her. She hunted back. The midwife's voice shortened into command, and the room adjusted its weight. Truth requires a label, so hear it plain. The rolls note a child named Henry born under these stones toward Candlemas. Truth also notes a mother who nearly did not follow him into mourning. She bit linen until threads imprinted her tongue. When the cloth fell, she tasted salt and old wood. Now, the midwife said, not cruel and not kind. She obeyed because the order contained the exit. A wet crown appeared, retreated, then insisted. Hands did their blunt, precise work. Light shifted across the rushes and took courage with it. The widow lifted the candle and gave the light back. A cry tried the air and failed. Another cry arrived, larger, certain of its right to remain. The midwife laughed once, a bright fracture in the quiet. "Good," she said, and stitched the word into the room. She did not hear the praise. She heard silence gather behind her ribs. The world narrowed to a cold ringing and a long corridor without doors. The clerk set the swaddled bundle aside for a single breath. He checked the mother's face and found no colour worth keeping. Blood came fast, and the midwife changed keys. She spoke to the other woman with hands, not sentences. The widow braced her daughter's shoulders and would not be moved. "Look at me," she said, and made the command a bridge. She looked because a cliff offered a plank. She crossed because there was nothing else. Cloth piled like winter drift and had to be replaced. Her pulse stepped away and considered not returning. Jasper's boot stopped moving. He held the jam as if stone might take some weight. Temple accounts suggest a small statue was turned to face the wall. The room allowed no witnesses who would not work. The midwife set a fist against the womb and spoke to blood as if it were an unruly child. The second woman mixed a draught from honey, boiled water, and a mystery she trusted. The clerk counted the beats between breaths and drafted a prayer he could not sign. Numbers became useless and stayed nearby anyway. A thread of warmth found her again. She chased it, stumbled, and refused to stop. "Stay," the widow said, not to the body, but to the will. The word fastened itself to a stud in the wall and held. Air returned in thin sheets, then thicker sheets. She gathered them with ordinary greed and did not apologize. The small creature objected under the cloth and proved a lung can reprove a room. The midwife approved of that kind of arrogance. Outside, gulls wrote crooked lines above the haven. Rain changed direction as if it had heard news. Steward lists confirm extra candles fetched from the South Press, and 2 braziers repaired with wire. Heat became policy rather than comfort. The child met the breast not for milk, but for treaty. He latched, then slept like a person who expects the world to continue. She lay back and learned how to re-enter a room after leaving it. It felt like arriving at a harbour after a too long channel. The midwife checked seams and accepted what could be accepted. She tied knots that claimed the body as still belonging to itself. The clerk returned to his bench and wrote 1 line without arithmetic. He wrote "kept," and the line did not crack. Jasper stepped inside for the first time and removed his cap. He looked at the child as if he were a point on a map that would finally connect roads. The widow exhaled a breath she had held since November. She placed a hand on her daughter's hair and left it there, a quiet weight. A coal popped in the brazier and painted the wall with brief red. Shadows arranged themselves politely and did not argue. She drank warm water that tasted faintly of tin. The draught steadied the room into a shape she could trust. The record shows the boy's name travelled quickly along Castle Street and then by boat to Bristol. The record does not show the decision that crystallised, while pain lost interest. She closed her eyes and saw the road east, full of men who believe paper can govern weather. Paper can't, but men insist. The child made a small fist and tested the air. It passed. She whispered into his hair the promise that had kept its edge through fever and stone. If he lived, he would not belong to the game that killed his father. A gull shouted once over the river as if to countersign. The sound reached the window slit and lost its sharpness on stone. By noon the sky unknotted and turned the haven silver. Steam rose from damp cloaks in the passage and softened the smell of pitch. They washed her face with warm water, and the cloth came away pink. She did not apologize for surviving. Survival had paid its fee. The midwife placed the child in a cradle made from a grain coffer. Wood accepted the new duty without complaint. Jasper spoke softly about riders at Haverfordwest and eyes at Carmarthen. He spoke of routes and timing, and a winter that had not finished its work. She listened with a stillness learned from pain. Stillness can be armour, it can also be a map. Night would bring new fractions to solve and men with pens. For the moment, Light sat obedient on the blankets and refused to leave. The vow changed shape and hardened. Whatever door she had forced today, she would use tomorrow. York's banners snapped along the Thames side, while frost glassed the keystones below Baynard's castle, and a London letter reports the Queen's flight, branded treason by mouths that needed a villain. The conflict hardened into allegiance performed under calculation. Lent hung over the city like a grey cloth. At Westminster Hall, voices stacked beneath hammer-beam angels and tried to sound like law. She walked Cheapside with a deliberate plainness that announced nothing. A poulterer shouted prices, and a bell from St. Mary-le-Bow measured out the distance to safety. The widow stood beside her, attention narrowed to doors and eyes. They carried prayer like a lantern cupped in wind. The clerk waited near Guildhall with receipts that would seem harmless if read too quickly. Steward lists confirm alms for St. Bartholomew's Poor, and candles for St. Michael's, a ledger's version of penance. Chroniclers insist York's triumph demanded public assent at speed. Assent could be given without surrender if one learned the right grammar. She learned it by heart. A nod here, a courtesy there, a silence that let others write their own bravery. The record shows she appeared at Baynard's Castle on a raw March morning. It does not show how she measured corridors as trap or corridor as passage. Inside, tapestries breathed cold. A steward took names with a quill that had ended other futures. Edward's men greeted with an ease that expected obedience. Names peeled from their tongues like bark. She offered what courts devour without noticing. Composure. She made it a blade wrapped as ribbon. At Paul's Walk, rumour turned like starlings. A deacon recited victories as if they were psalms with better steel. Will suggests she balanced on a knife that had no handle. Either edge would ask for blood. The widow counted seats, judged whose laughter was investment, and set her jaw. She wore patience the way masons wear dust. The clerk stitched errands through Fleet Street, Temple Bar, and back again. He gathered talk with the same economy he used on ink. A summons reached them at dusk. They were required at Westminster Hall for a declaration many would confuse with safety. She slept little before dawn. Snow tried to return and failed. Morning tasted of slate and smoke. The hall smelled of wet cloaks and fresh authority. Oaths were taken beneath carved kings who remembered nothing and pretended otherwise. A sergeant at law intoned phrases that had crushed better intentions than hers. She lifted her right hand and spoke the words that let her stay on the board. They left her mouth, and the room accepted the currency. That was the irreversible choice. It did not cure danger, it rearranged the terrain. A courtier praised sense and called it loyalty. He did not ask what survival sometimes costs at the till. The widow's eyes held a private ledger. Debits and credits changed colour, but not weight. A messenger brushed her sleeve near Paternoster Row and pretended not to. In his hand, a folded scrap with no seal waited for a private moment. The scrap named watchers along Tower Wharf. It advised altars where ears are few and candles honestly loud. She walked to St. Dunstan in the west at noon and knelt where stone forgets whispers. Temple's accounts suggest 2 coins left the palm and purchased smoke enough to hide a sentence. The clerk read the scrap near the porch and burned it with a steady hand. He coughed once and turned the ash with his boot until it learned to be quiet. By supper, she visited a Yorkist lady who loved little dogs and information. They exchanged compliments threaded with iron. The record shows a license granted to oversee certain rents despite old allegiances. Paper can be domesticated if fed with usefulness. At dusk, she returned by Ludgate and counted vendors shutting their stalls. Fish smell thinned along the shambles, and rain began talking to the lane. A boy trailed them and vanished near Holborn Bridge. She marked his face and added it to the day's arithmetic. Night let other work begin. The city's breath slowed and courtyards became rooms without walls. In Baynard's shadow, a clerk from the Exchequer corrected a figure and left a hole where certainty had stood. Numbers make excellent disguises. She met the widow under a lich gate, where rain clicked on wood. They spoke 3 sentences and closed 2 doors. A London letter reports York's council satisfied with her appearance. Satisfaction is a mood that spends badly. Enemies still tested fences. They sent greetings that wanted replies written in peril. She learned to smile with only part of her face. She learned to bless bread while moving the knife. The digger put his spade through thawed turf near Smithfield and uncovered a button that had belonged to a man who shouted the wrong name too late. He flicked mud from it and went on. At Greenwich Reach, barges nosed the tide and made no vows. Oars sculled quietly like thoughts that refuse sleep. By Lady Day the frost relented and left London damp and eager. She bought wax at Newgate Market and listened more than she paid. The clerk charted smaller streets where officials rarely bothered. Greyfriars Passage, Shoe Lane, the Turn by St Ethel Dreaders, each a letter in a careful alphabet. A man at Baynard's remarked that her courtesy had improved. He meant she had stopped being dangerous in visible ways. She accepted the error and offered thanks. Then she kept her own count. Chroniclers insist the new reign restored order. Order means the winners can predict themselves. She placed offerings at St Stephen's in the palace and considered whose shadows fell longest. Near the steps, a beggar blessed her with a voice trained by hunger. Steward lists confirm a small cart hired at the Fleet Street end and 3 packets of linen purchased without pattern. Linen carries many stories when told clearly. A Yorkist cousin asked if she would attend a feast beyond Bishopsgate. She begged a headache and left him to his laughter. On Paul's Walk, she paused under a window that stored gossip for winter. The wind moved the talk along like chaff and left the grain behind. The widow purchased pepper from a man who miscounted once and learned a lesson. She paid correct and remembered his face for a day when favours cost less. She visited Westminster again and let her gaze say gratitude. Eyes used correctly sign more than hands. A monk from the abbey hinted that ships still leave for places where names can heal. Hints are a currency safer than coin. The clerk dried a set of copies in a room that said nothing. He breathed on each page as if warming a hand before a risky task. By Ascension Tide, blossoms fouled gutters along Cornhill and made the city smell like sweet rot. Life always edits success with other truths. She stood on London Bridge and watched the river stack reflections. Usually the Thames takes things. Tonight it returned something like an answer. The record shows no oath beyond the one already sworn. It shows movement disguised as patience. Her vow, learned in winter and tempered at Pembroke, did not soften under York's gaze. It learned to bow and not to yield. As lamps stirred along Fleet Street, she saw how a message might slip from Chancery to Greyfriars, and then to a safer door. The route asked for courage disguised as errands. She turned from the river and walked toward Cheapside, counting steps that would become distances on other maps. Loyalty had acquired a second edge, and she planned to use it without bleeding. Red wax cooled on a folded note while a runner threaded Fleet Street, and a London letter reports watchers posted near Temple Bar with eyes like hooks. Conflict travelled faster than horses. The message had to outpace a rumour. Greyfriars Alley breathed coal smoke and wet parchment. He pressed the seal into a gloved palm and did not look back. Michaelmas lay ahead like a hush that could tip either way. The record shows coin and hope moving under rain toward ships that favoured bad weather. The widow counted candles in a room off Cheapside and measured which prayers were affordable. She carried purpose the way iron carries cold. The clerk, quill-thin, sleeves inked, mapped safe doors between St Bride's and Newgate, weighing footsteps as if they were sums. Steward lists confirm one purse of angels dispersed by thirds. A ledger learns to whisper. A scrap named Saint Malo, then crossed itself. Another scrap named Vans and pretended not to shake. By Compline, wind braided Thames breath into the lanes. He walked Shoe Lane with a folded paper under the tongue of his boot. Wills suggest the boy turned banner waited behind Breton walls, learning caution from stone and tides. Chroniclers insist patience and exile share a language older than crowns. On the south bank, a boat nosed the wharf near Blackfriars and pretended to be ordinary. Oars lifted like quiet arguments and set down their reasons. She stood in St Dunstan in the west at noon and lit 2 tapers for travel and for concealment. Temple accounts suggest the offering was small and sharp, a knife wrapped in smoke. Jasper's name was not written, but every route leaned toward it. Maps turned obedient when spoken to firmly. The clerk met a wool factor by the shambles and purchased air at the price of risk. The factor's wife handed bread and kept her story closed. News ran ahead of ships, so they used weather for disguise. Fog from Queenhithe licked the ropes until they learned to be invisible. At Paul's Cross, a friar shouted that false oaths rot teeth. She heard teeth and thought of hatchways and keels. The first packet went by cart to Southwark, wrapped in linen tight as a bruise. A second went under a cooper's hoops. The third hid in a tally book. A steward at Baynard's murmured a name wrong to test her. She smiled with only half her face and let him keep the mistake. A letter crossed Ludgate and turned right toward Holborn, where gossip slows to catch its breath. The clerk shadowed it until the messenger poured ale, then turned the corner that mattered. Steward lists confirm wax purchased in bulk near Foster Lane, enough to seal truth and fiction twice. Truth needed thicker wax. The widow bargained in a back room off Bread Street with a man who collected secrets as if they were rents. She paid with courtesy, coin, and the absence of apology. The message reached Gravesend with hours to spare. A barge waited like a swallowed oath and slipped downriver with the tide. Night erased faces and left only tasks. The clerk counted bridges as if bridges could answer for men. On the channel, swells lifted a small hull towards St. Malo. The rolls note storms that month refused to be negotiated. He watched the water drill its metal patience. He tucked his chin into the wind and tasted salt and debt. In Brittany, a boy learned to listen to courtyards. Walls speak when you respect their age. A Breton captain signed for the purse and tested each coin with a nail. He nodded to a scribe whose sleeves were not clean enough for innocence. Meanwhile, in London, a pardoner near Paternoster Row sold the comfort of paper to men who feared consequence. She bought nothing and remembered his face in case fear made him brave. A second shipment chose Rye and then the open sea. A London letter reports the watch at Dover blinked when fog handled the torchlight. The clerk bent over a chart by candle at St. Clement Danes and drew 3 routes that looked like veins. He liked maps because maps are honest about difficulty. Reversal arrived without trumpet. The man who had sold air sold breath to someone else. He moved a meeting from Greyfriars to St. Etheldrada's crypt and stood where stone makes words heavy. The traitor did not come. A child with 2 wide eyes came instead. She sent the child away with bread and a coin that would not stay long. Some rescues expire, some become debts that keep. Chroniclers insist a Yorkist ear brushed past Tower Wharf that week and caught a name. The ear belonged to a cousin who needed favour more than truth. Damage arrived, dressed as courtesy. An invitation placed her near a smile that did not reach its owner. She answered with arranged gratitude and edged the table 2 fingers left. 2 fingers can change a listening. The clerk delivered a blank roll to a scrivener and received it back pregnant with harmless lies. Harmless lies are sheepdogs when wolves know their business. By All Saints, letters turned salt-stained. A seal from Reedon bore a smear shaped like a crow. The boy across the water wrote of drills, hunger, and waiting for a wind pointed like a finger. He wrote of gratitude, and then crossed it out. The widow read the lines and smelled mildew, rope, and hope. She folded the paper until it learned obedience. Steward lists confirm a chest moved quietly from Bishopsgate to a house near Aldersgate, bolts sliding like modest thunder. The chest had a double floor and a patience for silence. A courier ate eel pie near Queenhithe and did not know he carried a country under his cloak. He was paid enough to forget afterward. A spy followed him to the stairs and then remembered his debts. Debt steered him home more fiercely than loyalty. On rain days, the clerk rehearsed how to fail convincingly. He practiced stammers and learned where to drop a page. He broke a seal in front of a guard and revealed a letter about fish prices at Billingsgate. The guard laughed and pocketed. Contempt. Contempt makes excellent blinders. She knelt in St. Stephen's and weighed which saints prefer practical petitions. She chose one and offered candour as if it were a jewel. A third purse aimed for St. Paul de Leon and chose instead a beach with no name. Oars slid like discretion through a skin of cold. Will suggests the boy, almost a man now, trained with swords that liked his hands. He learned to hold a gaze without being impolite. Back in London, a cousin asked her to say aloud which future she preferred. She named bread, law, and a bed that did not end in exile. He called that evasion. She called it architecture. The clerk fetched a token from a woman near Greyfriars, who never looked up. He placed it in a hollow step in Shoe Lane and walked away like a man who had nothing left. A man with frost on his beard watched and touched his cap. He would report that gesture and forget the street. By Advent, the tally was more courage than coin. Temple accounts suggest St. Brides received more wax than usual, because light teachers fear to wait. A message returned from Wren written neater than hunger. It named men who might be persuaded to remember the right winter. She read the names twice and set them down. Then she burned the paper over a dish and memorized the ash. The Channel wore its iron again and sent back ships with ribs that remembered. A captain said the boy smiled like weather holding steady. The widow walked Fleet Street at dusk and raised her hood against a drizzle honest about being rain. She passed the goldsmith who would never risk more than a nod. The clerk closed the ledger and left a page blank for the thing no one wanted recorded. He sharpened the pen and told it to be brave. A small fire took in a yard off Carter Lane, and smoke salted the talk. Someone asked whether hope can be laundered. Someone else said hope wears its stains like proof. They moved the last purse under a basket of onions. Onions made guards wave faster. At Queenhithe, rope burned palms and the barge pulled away. Oars agreed with the river and kept the bargain. Across the water, St. Malo's harbour loaded its gulls with noise and blessing. The rolls note weather that allowed landfall and then slammed doors behind. He took the chest with both hands and thanked a God he did not always understand. He would learn to understand debts. The reversal clarified itself in London when a smile finally reached its owner. The smile belonged to a man who had decided to wait. Waiting meant no arrest, no knock at odd hours, no public softness. Waiting also meant enemies grew bored and careless. The digger at St. Paul's churchyard cut a trench for winter rain and found a coin pressed thin by many prayers. He wiped it clean and put it back. By Christmas, the city smelled of rosemary and smoke and the Thames at low tide. She lit a taper and watched it steady between draughts. A steward from Baynard's bowed and pretended he had never misnamed. Her she permitted the fiction. Some victories thrive in private. The clerk brought a letter addressed to a window and not a person. He set it on the sill and waited for the wind to decide. A Breton hand had written that the boy stood taller and listened harder. The hand asked for more wax than silver. She smiled at that and sent both. Wax can bind, but silver buys the second boat. Night gathered above Ludgate, and snow began as if correcting the city's posture. She drew the curtain and let the world be winter. The vow she had honed across childbirth, feasts and oaths learned a new edge. It became a bridge across water and months. Beyond St. Malo, a young man walked a courtyard and counted steps until courage matched them. London answered with oars and seals and a patience that was not the same as peace. She closed her eyes and saw the road narrowing into a field she had not yet reached. When the wind turned, she would not miss it. Ambion Hill wore a crown of thorns at dawn, while mist curled above Redmore's marsh, and a London letter reports the White Boar Standard already testing the wind. 2 armies read the same field and reached for one country. Lammas heat lingered, though August had nearly spent itself. Gulls from the Trent's reaches circled as if summoned to witness. Henry's column formed near Fen Lane, drums small, faces set. Stanley banners kept their distance, bright and undecided as weather. Steward lists confirm Pikes bought deer in Wales and linen torn for bandages before sunrise. The clerk folded the receipt and held it like a warrant against chaos. In Westminster, the widow knelt beneath St. Margaret's north window and measured candle to prayer. She asked for outcomes that leave breath in chests and doors open to law. Chroniclers insist Richard took the ridge and meant to use it. Earth under Ambion knows the weight of certainty when hooves print intention into clay. The first culverins spoke like iron prophets. Smoke drifted low, tasting of saltpetre and yesterday's storms. Men shifted along hedges by Sutton Cheney and checked straps with hands that had learned new scars. Hedges learned to keep secrets. Henry rode the line with the red dragon uncoiling behind him. He tipped his cap to farmers drafted into history against their wishes. A priest near Dadlington murmured a shape of mercy and then ducked. Mercy prefers roofs. The record shows Percy held the northern wing and held it too still. Silence can be strategy. It can also be refusal named prudence. Stanley kept his men angled like questions. Their lances shone without answering. Wind turned, artillery settled. Then bows lifted and found their range. A flight of arrows stitched the margin where marsh means to own men. Screams took the field's true temperature. Jasper leaned close and spoke plain economy. Keep the core intact, trade space for breath, buy minutes with iron. Henry nodded once, a coin laid down. The clerk carried messages between troop knots, counting faces he would not see again by vespers. Counting steadied him when ground failed. The widow closed her eyes and named Ambion, Shenton, and Stoke Golding aloud. Names anchor fear. Fear dislikes anchors. Chroniclers insist Richard read the measure, lowered his lance, and chose to cut the head from the wager. He rode down the slope with pennons tight and murder honest. For a breath the field forgot to breathe. Then horses broke the air like ovens opening. The white boar drove for Henry's standard through men who had paid their last coin already. Steel rang like bells rung wrong. Jasper met the point with angle and grit. 2 retainers fell, and the gap asked for Henry's bones. A standard-bearer staggered, then set his feet in mud that pretended to be floorboards. He held because some men remember one job at the end. The clerk saw the king's crest and felt history remove its gloves. He ran messages until messages blurred and only direction remained. Wills suggest Stanley took a heartbeat longer than honour likes. Then the banners tipped, not toward Richard, but toward wages due and futures possible. They came at a slope-eating trot, hedges shaking gossip into birds. The collision rewrote noon. Richard's guard made a ring and bled for the time a ring buys. A blade printed a boar onto a breast that had stopped arguing. Norfolk fell where nettles keep counsel. Horse screamed. Mud accepted new duties with practiced silence. Henry's cap slipped. Hands set it back as if resetting a hinge. Jasper's shout cut the weather and found a reply. Chroniclers insist the king pressed for the kill and vanished under a grammar he could not edit. A billhook argued last and wrote the period. Wind turned again because wind enjoys victory least. Men discovered breath by accident and used it like thieves. Between hedges a crown appeared where thorns had hoarded morning. A Welsh hand lifted it with the care given to breakable futures. The clerk watched the arc from thorn to brow and felt numbers become ceremony. He did not cry. He learned to stand still. Steward lists confirm no purple, only sweat, soil, and a circlet gone dull. Brightness returns later with washing and policy. The widow rose in Westminster and let wax drip onto stone as proof of receipt. She did not smile. Smiles spend too fast. By mid-afternoon, carts complained toward Leicester along Fen Lane. Bow Bridge waited with water that erases. A London letter reports Richard's body crossed the span barefoot, face to sky, to prove kingdoms unfasten. Witnesses obeyed their stomachs and looked away. The digger measured ground at Dadlington churchyard, thumb on spade shaft, eyes on rain. He set a depth that says, respect without promising permanence. He did not ask where crowns sleep. He asked where water goes after storms. Back on the field near Ambion, hawks hunted low over tents that had learned to be roofs for grief. A child searched among horses for a father and found only tack. Jasper counted survivors and debts. He arranged an escort that meant Henry would not vanish into congratulations. Percy stayed pale and informative. Stanley handled courtesies with an expertise sharpened by timing. The record shows a pronouncement made before sunset, plain and sufficient, king by right of conquest and possession. Right, like iron, learns its shape under heat. Henry took the circlet and did not flinch at its plainness. Plainness travels farther than pageantry when roads are uncertain. The clerk wrote 3 lines that refused ornament. They named Ambion. They named the crown. They named who still breathed. Bells in Leicester learned a new pattern. Some rang gladness, others measured debt. The widow walked from St. Margaret's to the river steps and tasted ash on the wind. Ash tastes like endings that choose to be beginnings. At twilight, men searched hedgerows for names. Hedgerows gave up buttons, knives, and a ribbon already forgetting its wearer. Chroniclers insist someone shouted treason where Richard fell. Chroniclers also insist the ground insists on silence afterward. Jasper spoke of London routes and which gates honour good news without charging for it. He trusted Ludgate and distrusted Smiles near Baynard's. Steward lists confirm wax ordered at St. Paul's and St. Stephen's, because gratitude requires light to keep its shape. Gratitude and policy shook hands at dusk. The digger tamped the last spadeful and drew a cross in mud with a finger. He turned once to the field and once to his home. Night rinsed the hill and left it cleaner than men deserve. Torches dropped sparks that tried to become stars. Henry slept little. Maps do not sleep and prefer company. The clerk folded receipts into a leather case and placed it under his cloak, because paper attracts weather. He checked the straps and set his face for road. The widow sat with a candle guttering and imagined tomorrow's angles. Power must be handled like glass in frost. The wind softened and pulled east, toward London's towered breath. Some enemies would pretend to be friends. Some friends would forget how to stand. Ambion Hill cooled under August's last light and kept its new grammar. Morning would require a kingdom to read it correctly. Frost silvered the cloister at Cambridge, while a bell from Great St. Mary's tolled the hour, and the record shows a royal mother walking beneath the arcades with purpose wrapped in wool. Power had come home with her son. Solitude came as its cost. Michaelmas term pressed the town with carts and wet straw. Ink, rain, and hearth smoke braided in the air like an old argument that would not retire. She read a charter by candle near Trumpington Gate and let the wax harden without hurry. A London letter reports that Southwark taverns already weighed new rumours with their ale. The clerk stood at a table inside Christ's and counted pledges that behave better on parchment than in purse. Steward lists confirm coal delivered to the kitchens and a payment to masons who did not love schedules. She moved through the hall with a quiet that made noise polite. Names bent toward her the way rushes bend to a passing boat. Chroniclers insist she traded courtrooms for chapter rooms, and banquets for statutes. She called that bargain a mercy. At King's Parade, wind carried chalk dust and psalm tunes. The scent of vellum and sanded ink hung under the oaken roof. She had learned that victory asks for servants the size of institutions, so she built servants that do not die in the night. The rolls note her refoundation of Christ's, a chambered heart for scholars and clerks. Will suggests St. John's would follow by her will and other hands, because death likes to interrupt useful women. She lifted a seal and pressed it hard enough to feel through skin. Decision became law, while rain found the gutters along King's Ditch. News from London travelled without manners. A boy in Dublin with a borrowed crown. A sailor near the stews murmuring a York name over wine. She sent word across Bishopsgate and Tower Wharf, and pretended to accept congratulations. Courtesy can turn a blade by a finger's breadth. The widow sat with her at a window that hunted light down King's Lane. They spoke of rules that keep faith with pain rather than pride. The clerk organised rents from Chesterton Fields, and checked that the porter at Trumpington Street understood who might pass without question. He wrote letters that sounded like invitations and were fences instead. She met masters whose fingers smelled of lamp oil and asked how far the mind can build walls that keep. They answered with books and arguments and the grammar of long patience. Inside the kitchens, time and steam rose like small hymns. A boy salted eels and burned his thumb and pretended not to mind. A messenger came wet from Cheapside and knelt too fast. He brought news that peace had a hole, and enemies breathed where the river turns to gossip. She remembered Bosworth and the crown rising from thorn to brow. Then she remembered how quickly thorn grows back. At St. Saviour's in Southwark, a gambler with clean hands said a name that should have stayed under water. Men listened because winter teaches hunger. A good ear. She tightened the town with threads men rarely see. A bursar received a purse with fewer coins and more instructions. The clerk wrote to Baynard's Castle in a hand that invited delay when delay helped. He carried copies in a leather case and dried them near a grate until smoke reddened the margins. Chroniclers insist she took a vow to live chaste within marriage, which is one way to tell a house that work matters more than comfort. The vow made corridors longer and rooms quieter. She walked past St. John's Hospital and watched the digger set stakes for a trench where foundation walls would want dry feet. He measured by thumb and habit while sleet needled the air. His spade made a wet sound the ground understood. He raised his cap when her shadow crossed and returned to the line. Inside, the chapel collected breath and transmuted it. Candles made a thin warmth that encouraged memory to behave. The clerk brought accounts from Vintry Ward, where wine runs like policy. He assigned figures their corners and set aside a page for mercy. A letter from Westminster asked her to smile where trouble required. She trimmed the smile and sent it folded. By Advent, the town smelled of damp wool and fur. Scholars argued under archways until their breath looked like scripture. She placed coin where books would multiply and left strict instructions about what not to flatter. Flattery builds poor roofs. A man from Southwark presented himself like a gift and offered accurate malice for a price. She accepted the information and paid with courtesy that would not be invited twice. The road to Ely shone with frost and cart ruts. The fens held their cold like a church holds silence. She rode as far as Barnwell Priory and collected a tone of mind, one that asks less of applause and more of time. The sky kept its grey. Her resolve learned to draw a straight line within it. The clerk drafted statutes about discipline that protected study against appetite. He developed a taste for sentences that close all windows and leave one door. Chroniclers insist the Star Chamber learned to pronounce calmly what earlier ages had shouted. She understood calm can be a weapon and taught her household to polish it. At Oxford, strangers measured Cambridge with a frown and made promises to their own grey stone. Competition keeps candles honest. A courtier from Whitehall arrived through Bishopsgate with news that smiles had sharpened. He spoke of pretenders pressed into corners and corners that remember. She placed her hand on the Charter of Christ's and felt paper warm. It is an old trick, but it works. She asked the clerk how many boys had meat that week and how many had bread alone. Numbers that live in stomachs do not lie. Steward lists confirm an extra purchase of barley and a delay in new hangings for the hall. Elegance can wait when hunger won't. She gave the porter at King's Lane a phrase to use when the wrong visitor wore the right clothes. He practised it until it lost fear. A winter wind stroked the cloister and raised powdered frost from the edge of stone. The bell at Great St. Mary's rang for Compline and made the hour gentler. She stood in the chapel and named her dead. Names gathered like a small company and agreed to help. The vow from Pembroke put on a new coat here. It preferred rules to knives and made rooms where both could rest. The digger bent to his trench and found a tile from an older house. He wiped it and set it where a boy might see the colour and imagine a future warm with roofs. The clerk took a receipt from a mason whose breath smelled of lime and tired bread. He wrote "keep" in the corner, as if the word could train walls to stand. A scent of rosemary moved through the buttery. Outside, the cam ran dark as hammered lead and patient as law. She walked to King's Parade and looked east where morning begins its work. She thought of a son who studied faces now instead of fields. A London letter reports that the city's south bank had grown quieter, which means danger remembered to blink. She did not return the courtesy. By Candlemas, boys scribbled at tables like men who knew time cheats. Ink smudged fingers and turned sleeves into maps of effort. She sat with the master and chose lecturers who prized truth over fashion. Fashion mends nothing in a winter of rumours. The clerk visited Cheapside and purchased paper that would not tear when folded twice. He refused ribbon with bells. At St. Saviour's, a singer opened his mouth and released a note that survived the stew's stink. Beauty sneaks into the worst rooms and asks for water. She endowed a lectureship when a belt of coin could have become softer shoes. Feet can ache, minds feed many. Chroniclers insist a final attempt rose and fell like a wave that has run out of cliff. She arranged a witness list and made silence afterward respectable. A message rode north with 4 seals and returned with tidings thin as gruel, but enough for the day. She marked the map with a pin and made the pin a mean patience. The digger pounded a stake flush and judged the line true. He imagined a wall there with students arguing the world into a kinder shape. The clerk stacked statutes, charters and receipts in a chest lined with felt. He locked it and put the key where only habits find it. Snow fell, then stopped as if embarrassed. Torches hissed at the gate, and a horse shook iron into the yard. She read the last of the day's letters and set aside the one with too much perfume. Perfume makes policy slippery. A child in the college kitchen snored under a bench and dreamed of bread. Someone covered him with a coarse cloth that still held warmth. She remembered the door in Pembroke that almost did not open and the cry that made a kingdom possible. She kept that sound behind her teeth and let it instruct. A man from Suffolk crossed the Cam and did not reach Trumpington Street. The porter recited the phrase he had practised, and the man turned slowly and chose air instead of stone. The wind backed to the east and brought the harbour taste of Lynn down the river. It salted the lips and cleaned the mind. She stepped into the cloister and let frost talk to her shoes. The hour would not last, but what she had built would prefer centuries. That was the reversal, quiet and complete. Battle's noise traded for the grammar of foundations. The choice would not unmake itself. At Compline, the choir found a note that carried farther than the roof. It left the building and went to London with the dust on travellers' sleeves. The clerk closed the chest, banked the fire, and wrote a line that needed no arithmetic. He wrote "kept" again, knowing the word now had stone to lean against. The digger shouldered his spade and watched the sky turn iron near Barnwell. He nodded to himself, because earth keeps promises if you measure right. She touched the seal of Christ one more time and listened to its small, cooled breath. Enemies still breathed in Suffolk, but the house she wanted now possessed lungs. Night took the court, and Cambridge held its lights steady. She turned toward the work that would outlive her, and walked until the frost learned her name.